I was an officer for the Minneapolis Police Department. This happened in the summer of 2007, and it is, without a doubt, the strangest thing I've ever encountered in my entire life. It started with some odd reports. Strange sightings that most of my department was convinced that it was an elaborate joke. Towards the end of it, we just stopped taking down the reports when we would get calls about it. The first call was from a college student. She was studying at a university in the area and claimed to have seen a creature on the roof of one of the buildings. The call came in on a Friday night, and when I heard the word creature, I assumed that drugs or alcohol were involved. She described a feathered bird man with glowing red eyes. I was on the phone with her at the station, and some of the other officers started listening in when I asked her to describe the creature. I asked what the Birdman was doing, and it took every ounce of self-restraint I had to keep from laughing. She said the Birdman was just standing there, staring at her. I asked if the Birdman was doing anything illegal, and the girl hung up. In hindsight, I was definitely being a smart ass, but how was I supposed to believe any of that? A Birdman with glowing red eyes? We deal with a lot of drug cases, and that's the kind of story I would get from someone on drugs, so I didn't think much of it. However, we got another call the next day. This time it was from a woman in her 40s working the weekend shift at a mall department store. She closed up for the night and headed to her car in the parking lot, and there, standing under a lamppost, was the dark silhouette of a man with wings. And get this, he had glowing red eyes. I thought the other officers were pranking me. There was no way there was another call in about a menacing winged man. I told them nice try and went on with the rest of my day. But it didn't end there, not by a long shot. Over the next 2 weeks, we had numerous calls about this creature. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sometimes it was described as having red eyes, sometimes gold or amber. All the callers said it was about 5.5 to 6 feet tall and had wings. Not a single person saw its face. Sometimes it was on a roof. Sometimes it was just standing on the ground in the shadows. No one ever saw it fly anywhere. After about the 6th call, I started to look into this as much as I could. There wasn't a whole lot to go on, and the whole thing became a joke in our department. There would be bets on if we would get a call about the creature that day. We had wondered if there was maybe some new hallucinogenic drug out there causing people to see this thing. The other theory floating around was that there was some guy dressing up as this creature and trying to scare people. That was the theory that made the most sense to me. But you'd think that with all the driving around we all do at night, one of us would have seen it by now. When I couldn't find any other information, I did a quick Google search and tried to find something that matched the descriptions. I did find something interesting. The Mothman. Now, I didn't really believe in all that stuff, but the sketches I saw of it were just like the descriptions we had been getting. I continued my search, trying to find some reason that these creatures were all of a sudden popping up when there had been no evidence of them here previously. I didn't find much, but I did read that sometimes they show up just before something bad is about to happen. I got a sinking feeling in my stomach. I'm not sure exactly why, because like I said, I don't believe in this stuff, but I couldn't shake the feeling. We continued to get in reports of this thing, but that was about it. It had never attacked anyone or shown signs of aggression. It was just there. And still none of us had yet to see one. Of course, we would jokingly say we saw the Birdman at a traffic stop and things like that, but it was just such an absurd thing that it was impossible not to joke about. The reports came in by the dozens during the last week of July. The creature was in the road. It was on the roof of the bank. It was in an alleyway. There was just no end to it. The reports were so numerous that we were told to search for this thing on our patrols. My superiors were convinced that it was a person or a group of people playing an elaborate prank, which, to be fair, was the logical explanation. The following week, just after 6 in the evening on August 1st, the I-35W bridge over the Mississippi River collapsed. It was a sudden freak accident due to a fatal design flaw of the bridge. It was loaded with rush hour traffic at the time. It was bad. There were 13 total deaths, I believe, and about 150 injuries. I didn't put it together at the time, but after that, the sightings of the creature stopped altogether. I still can't say exactly what the creature was since I never saw it myself. I don't know if the thing was evil or it came as a warning. I don't think anyone really knows. I do know that if I ever hear a report of one again, I'm taking my family and leaving town immediately. I was spending the week with my mom and my new stepdad up in northern Michigan. It was 2017 and I was halfway through high school. Classes were still in session, but on account of my mom's new marriage, my brother and I were allowed to spend some extra family time together outside of school. My mom seemed to feel a vacation would somehow bring us all closer, so we rented a cabin. It was all right, I guess. It was a quaint little place with a bit of a kitschy country feel, not like the city where I was used to living. I thought my new stepdad was a little weird. He liked to tell stories about werewolves and other creepy cryptid creatures. He believed they were all somehow related. In my opinion, the creatures were one and the same, but that was only based on what I heard, not actual facts. My stepdad was convinced he'd actually seen one of the creatures when he was a boy. I guess that's what started his whole infatuation with the idea. I personally have never been one to blindly believe anything anyone told me. I needed proof. The Dogman, for example, was a highly unlikely being. A creature with a man's body and the head of a dog. I had a strong interest in biology, and the whole thing just didn't add up genetically. On that fateful day when everything changed, I had just entered the dining room. My brother was just about to take a bite out of his sandwich. He could see the look on my and my stepdad's faces, and his eyes shifted from our stepdad and then to me. We both were staring over my brother's shoulder and out the window behind him. My stepdad and I exchanged astonished glances. We just couldn't believe what was happening. There in the backyard was a man hunkered over with his head in our charcoal grill. It was odd behavior, to say the least. My stepdad had made us all steak and a salad for lunch, but the surface of the grill had been cool to the touch for some time, so why anyone would want to sniff the bricks of coal was beyond me. I think my brother thought we were staring at him. He lowered his sandwich down toward his plate, as if being silently judged. My stepdad and I, of course, weren't judging anyone. We continued to watch in horror as the man lifted his shaggy mane and sniffed around. It was then we realized this was no ordinary man. In fact, it wasn't a man at all. The shirtless human male torso appeared to be chestnut brown in color. Yet, the head was what captivated us the most. Long strands of hair, wispy and thick like a Pomeranian, painted on in thick coats of jet black, coppery red and a shock of white, stretched out on both sides of its face. Oh, but the eyes! The eyes were what kept us mesmerized. They were both a piercing amber color. I'd never seen anything so strange and so beautiful in my entire life. The creature straightened his stance. He knew he'd been seen and that we were watching him. I tugged on my stepdad's shirt sleeve. We sprinted from the dining room through the kitchen toward the back door and towards the patio area. We both charged for the door. My stepdad beat me there, but I wasn't upset. All I could think about was getting a better look at the creature outside. Once my stepdad and I stumbled our way out into the open, the impossibly tall, dog-like man began to back up while still staring at both of us. I reached out my hand, unsure if the creature would act like a dog or a man. To my utter amazement, the creature howled. At least I think it was a howl. It kind of sounded like a human screaming. Its teeth were long and curved, like miniature spikes, only much thinner. They were still bigger in size than a large breed canine's teeth. None of them were jagged like in the urban legends I'd heard in the past. My blood began to curdle, and I started to seriously wonder why we had come outside. Both of my palms started to sweat, and my heart raced like crazy inside my chest. Fight or flight had kicked in, and I wished desperately it would all go away, but I couldn't. I had forgotten how to move. My stepdad hadn't, though. He had slipped his cell phone deftly out of his back pants pocket and was lifting it to capture a few seconds of live footage. Upon seeing the phone, the creature spun around quickly. Now I could see that its lower torso appeared to be that of a canine. It was strange to watch it run off on 2 feet, and I actually doubted that I was really seeing what I was seeing. In my opinion, I don't think canines were ever meant to run as bipeds. It gives them a strange kind of gait, or at least this one was strange. It almost bounced as I watched it bob up and down in a blur of speed. I stared after it for a long time, eventually staring at the spot where it ran off into the trees. My stepdad looked almost giddy with a huge grin on his face. I had never seen him smile so big in all the time I'd known him. I was astonished that he wasn't afraid at all, and I was hoping he had gotten some footage, but when I peeked over to watch his video, the image was distorted. My stepdad frowned and scratched his head. His spirits had now clearly plummeted. I kind of felt bad for him. He'd waited so long to prove the existence of these wild creatures, and now it had shown up and he had no proof, other than the fact that my brother and I had both seen it. In some strange way, witnessing the Dogman so close and in person had brought me and my stepdad a little closer than we once were. I guess we now had more in common since I believed, just like him. We headed back inside the house, not in defeat, but as a newly formed team in search of the truth. I know it exists. He knows it exists. My suggestion is to never stop believing in these creatures. I know I won't. It was 1997, and I was camping with my sister at Craig Lake State Park in northern Michigan, up on the UP. It was the middle of summer, and unfortunately we're expecting a heat wave on the exact week of our trip. We had both taken off from work already, so we decided to go anyway and try to enjoy it. We planned to sleep in our hammocks and brought bug nets to hang above them. If you've never been to the Midwest, we have mosquitoes here that are just huge. We brought a tent too, as it looked like we might have a little rain in the middle of the week. But neither of us wanted to sleep in a tent when the nighttime temperature didn't look like it was going to get below 80. Our campsite was a hike-in spot, but it was only about 4 miles from the parking lot. We were both sweating buckets by the time we hauled all our gear to the site, and I wondered if we would be able to survive the week or if we would roast alive. Most of the week went fine. Very hot and a little miserable, but we didn't run into anything strange. When I hear people tell stories like this, and there's almost always something they missed in hindsight, but here there was nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing at all. On the 5th day, it had begun to rain about halfway through the day. It started out as a little rain, but got significantly worse as the day progressed. It was just starting to get bad as we returned from our morning hike, so we took down our hammocks and set up the tent. By dinner time, it was pouring. We obviously couldn't get a fire started, so we cooked dinner in the vestibule on a little butane stove. The tent had started leaking about an hour or so later, and then the wind picked up. There was a pool of water on the floor of our tent when we decided we'd rather hike the 4 miles back to the car. We figured we could probably find a hotel room in town, and if not, at least we would be dry in the car. The trail to the parking lot was well marked, and we should have easily found our way back. The rain and wind were making it hard to see, so when we thought we saw the red taillights of another car, we headed straight for it. It looked exactly like taillights, bright red and glowing in the distance. It looked maybe 60 or 70 feet away from where we were on the trail. The trail had gotten soupy from all the rain, and it became difficult to tell if we were on it or not. We tried to use the light as a guide to follow back to the parking lot, but we ended up stepping directly into a swamp. The sudden change in footing surprised us both, and we fell forward into the mud. It was that sticky type of mud that holds you in. I don't think it was quicksand, but it was difficult to get out of. When we had climbed back onto the trail, we sat there on the ground, staring at this light that appeared to be dead center in this swamp. My sister was worried it was a car that had driven off the road, but it wasn't sinking, and we didn't hear anyone screaming for help. I didn't know what it was, but something felt off about the whole situation. If it was a car, it's not like we would be able to help them anyway. We barely got ourselves out of the mud. We continued on in the direction we hoped was the parking lot. We decided we would call the police about the possible stuck car when we got back to ours. The rain got heavier, if that was even possible, and the strange red light faded into the distance. Not more than 10 minutes later, we saw another light. Red, about 3 feet off the ground, looked just like the tail light of a car. This time, it was in the middle of a forest. I recognized this area. We were almost to the parking lot, but this particular area was heavily wooded. No way would a car even fit between the trees in here. I said it can't be a car, that it must be a person with a red lantern or a red headlight. My sister called out to see if anyone needed help. No answer. My sister wanted to go in there and see what it was, but I definitely did not. But the longer I stared at the light, the more I wanted to investigate it too. I felt strange, watching it, almost like I was in a trance. And then light moved. It dropped to the ground. It was maybe 1 foot off the ground now. It came towards us, slithering like a snake through the trees. I had an overwhelming sense of dread. My sister and I didn't need to say anything, we just ran. I looked back to see the red light following us, but it stopped when it got to the edge of the trail. I never figured out what it was. My sister didn't have any explanation for it either. We did call the non-emergency police line when we got back to our car and reported a car possibly stuck in the swamp, but her and I both knew that whatever was out there wasn't taillights from a car. I was driving home on an isolated road through thick mountain country. It was late and dark, and I honestly couldn't have told you where I was. All I knew was that I needed to stay on the road I was on until I finally left the state and hit home territory. I was bobbing in and out of consciousness. You know how it is when you're exhausted and trying to push on. I had tried, and I didn't want to admit it. I had even chugged a rock star not too long before this, but my body was so exhausted that even the caffeine and the extra boost of that wasn't giving me what I needed, and I was too cheap to spend the money to lay up in a hotel. It became really hard when the rain began to fall, since that sound could put anybody to sleep. I was notorious for using white noise to help me sleep anyway, so that was just the nail in the coffin for me. However, when I was coming up on a bridge, this is where my story happened. My headlights lit up something that looked just like a person, except almost double, if not triple, in size. I had to swerve to avoid it, and I sure as hell woke up from that. I wasn't sure if I clipped him or her or it, but my car went sliding and went straight into a ditch. The first thing I did was get out to make sure that I hadn't just hit somebody. Why would there be somebody out here in the middle of nowhere that's wearing all black? There was no one around, and I was pretty sure that there had been somebody in the road. I was certain of it. And I was more than a little mad at them for not making sure I was okay. I swear, it felt like the rain had just begun, but my car was good and stuck, and the tires wouldn't grip the mud that was suddenly all on the ground. I didn't want to call for a tow truck, but it was looking like my only option. I sat in my car in the sound of the downpour and tried phoning out when I was sure I'd seen movement that was more than just the rain. I was hoping it was help, but looking around, it didn't show me anything to speak of. I shook my head, wondering if it would be a good idea just to sleep right here in the ditch and wait for the tow truck. It might be a little weird, but after all, maybe a good 45-minute nap is what I needed. My thoughts were shaken from my head when the driver's side window was suddenly blocked by the drenched, furry body of something very tall and ugly. It was walking on 2 legs, but there was no way that this was human. This was a beast of the woods, the closest I've ever come to thinking of some animal as demonic. I never used that description, but this was so ugly and evil-looking, it's the only word that I feel would be appropriate. It was pointing its snout right at me and baring its teeth in a menacing grin, like it was smiling at me, like it was happy that I was trapped in this little metal container called a car. I briefly pictured those long yellow fangs sinking into my flesh. In fact, the worst part was its eyes. There was no soul in them, but they were alive with a cold light. I'm not exaggerating. They almost had a faint glow to them. It was supernatural in a sense. The dimness of the weather made that very clear. It ran its claw on my window, which made a squealing sound. And that's about the point that I lost complete bladder control. It was so sadistic, so evil. It drug its claws slowly over my window, all while maintaining a stare and a grin, like it was letting me know, ha ha, you're stuck in there. There's no way you can run, nowhere you can hide. You're all mine. But I'm going to make you terrified before I kill you. That's the impression I got from this thing. Those claws were way too long for any practical purpose other than killing. I quickly jammed the lock button on my door just in case it was smart enough to use the door handle. We continued a horrible stare down for what felt like ever. Another wolf thing came out from the downpour, and then another one. I think in total I spied 4 separate ones altogether. This was at the time when old man phones were the current phones, and I flipped my phone open. Needless to say, I tried to get pictures, but they were crap. It looked like I had taken pictures of a movie playing on my TV. All at once, these things disappeared, and I found out why. A farmer-looking type of guy pulled up on the road and volunteered to pull me out of the ditch. After the job was done, I thanked him profusely and told him that I had almost become lunch for animals that I'd never seen before. I explained to him, assuming he had saw them, that they were upright wolves that looked like they were from hell. He got a look on his face, and after that I tried to ask him questions, but he seemed very dismissive. I've held on to these memories all these years, but again, they're just memories. Even when I've tried to talk to a therapist about it, they don't even believe me. It's just one of the stories that you can't hold in. I saw something, and more of them. This was a pack of animals. I felt like I was in a werewolf movie since they all looked very identical. Whatever this big one was, which was the biggest of all of them, by the way, was only mere inches away from my face, separated by a very thin sheet of glass. The only reason I'm alive, I believe, is because of my car window. But then again, this thing was so menacing, so large and so powerful, I feel like it was just toying with me. Because if it really wanted to kill me, I don't see any reason why it couldn't have ripped my door open and pulled me out and killed me. I can't just carry something like this for the rest of my life and not share it. I'm sharing this with you in hopes you can help me get this out there, to help quelch the fear of anybody else who feels invalidated by their own experiences and encounters, or in fear of being mocked. I have the trauma, and I will forever live with this story. So about 2 years ago, I had to move because I got a promotion and needed to switch cities. I moved from Chicago to San Francisco. I'm a single parent, so it was difficult already, but my kids had a hard time adjusting to the city. It was completely different. Money was tight, so I had to rent a small apartment, and the goal was to only be there for a few months, no longer than a year, until I could upgrade us to a better one. It wasn't much of a place, but it was good enough. There was a kitchen, a bathroom, and my kids shared a room while I slept on the couch. We were there for a few weeks when one of my kids began waking me up in the middle of the night because they were having nightmares. This was unusual, but I thought it was just stress. She would talk about a tall man who wouldn't let her sleep. Like I said, weird, but stress does things to kids. My oldest child was struggling to sleep too, but just said she didn't feel tired. I thought it was jet lag. A week or so later, I came home from work in the early afternoon. I get home before the kids do, so I try to make them their snacks. I was in the kitchen when I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me. There was nothing there, but I thought maybe I heard the neighbors. I turned on the stove and suddenly it was like I was shoved. My sleeve caught on fire, but thankfully I wasn't hurt. When my kids came home that day, my youngest was pale and shaky and had a fever. She spent the whole night screaming and yelling about the tall man. Throughout the night, things just got weirder. Doors opened on their own, plates were smashed on the ground, the apartment was icy cold and was filled with this awful stench like rotting meat. I decided to take my kid to the ER, and as we closed the door behind us, there was a lot of banging and rattling from inside the apartment. By the time we made it to the ER, my kid was fine, fell asleep in my arms. We made it back by early morning and it was beyond trashed. Everything was broken, pillows were torn to shreds, boxes emptied, dressers flipped over. It was awful. This was the start of the hell we would start to live in. Every night the house would be trashed. We just lived in constant filth. My youngest began to have behavioral issues that led to them being suspended for trying to attack another student. She became increasingly violent and had to be locked away at night, and my oldest had to sleep on the couch with me. I consulted behavioral experts and therapists for her, but nothing helped. As she grew more violent, so did the instances around the apartment. There were times I would wake up to a pillow pressed against my face. The burners on the stove turned on, or water running while the drains were clogged. After a year, I had enough, broke the lease, and moved us to a motel for a little while. Once again, my youngest became horribly ill and spent hours vomiting. She was sick for a few days, but once she was better, she was no longer violent. She was very calm and back to her normal self. But after a few weeks, it came back. Weird things happened around the motel. She became aggressive, and I began hearing and seeing things. I'm not crazy when I say this, but I would see a tall, dark figure out of the corner of my eyes. Sometimes it would just stand there, but other times it would seem to come at me. I began to have awful nightmares where I would see it. Often I would die and wake up sweating and shaky. My youngest began sleepwalking, and I'd often find her trying to leave or grabbing a knife or something. I began to do some research and seen that maybe we were being haunted by a ghost or a demon or some evil being. So I bought some crosses and put them up in the room. Every night they would fall to the ground, no matter how they were put up. I'd rest it on a dresser and it would end up halfway across the room. Eventually, I tried to contact a local church. Of course, whenever we got there, she was perfectly normal. They tried to ask her questions, splashed holy water, all kinds of stuff, but she didn't react in any way they wanted her to. We took them to the motel room, where they questioned her and seemed to try to provoke the evil in her once again, but nothing happened. They basically told me she was perfectly fine, but that they'd pray for her. They didn't think anything evil was haunting or attacking us. That night, everything was so much worse. Things were being thrown across the room, and my youngest attacked me while she was sleepwalking. She had this inhuman strength. It was like fighting a grown man. I called again and asked for help, but once again she acted normally. They didn't say anything, but it definitely felt like they thought I was lying. I've spent the past year moving around just to get a few weeks of sanity back. Fortunately, I was able to do my work remotely, but my kids are struggling in school. My youngest is always in trouble, and I'm afraid to even let her leave the house. It doesn't matter what I do. This thing always returns, and it won't go away. I can't keep doing this to my kids, and I want my child back.